just get started so we have more time for discussion. So before I lose my visual contact and kind of put the presentation up there, I will introduce myself. My name is Justin Sachs. I am currently a PhD student in design at Lancaster University. And prior to this, I've worked for 20 years in the field of alternative economics and sustainable development. So I got my start at the New Economics Foundation as a senior researcher in 2002. And I've been working ever since then in various forms, including as a startup, as a freelancer, to work with communities to build more control over how the shape of their economy looks. And so I'm coming to design more from my economics background, looking at how design can answer some of the gaps I see in particularly how people imagine the future. And particularly how people imagine a post-capitalist future, which is to say a future that is not based on capitalism. And my master's degree is in economic history, and so I can assure you that all systems do ebb and flow and come and go, and so there is a future. And so economics does not really stir the emotions for many people, so how do we use design as a way to engage with people? And particularly what was looking to do is to use design as a way to translate a body of work in economics called the commons or commons-based peer production. I'll explain all those terms shortly. But basically a whole field that shows how communities can control the resources around them. But it's not accessible because it's in this other field. And like anything, it's very hard to access a whole body of literature. And so when people have questions about how do we do things differently, they often think they have to reinvent the wheel. But actually, there's a whole body of literature, there's journals, and it's just how do we translate that into an approach that other people can use so that more people can apply these kinds of this design approach for more types of subjects. So that's really kind of my goal, is to use it. So I'm inventing a new type of design, but not the economics underpinning it is very robust, is kind of what I want to underpin. So I will now go to share, and I'm pretty sure this is where you can turn your video off if you want to relax. Oh, you've disabled screen sharing, host. Okay, now I can share. Okay. Okay, oops, that's the very beginning. So you can disable your video because I can't see you anymore. You can see me, so I'm aware that I use my hands a lot. And this is meant to be, I aspire to make this understandable for anybody. I'm still working on that. So if things are unclear, it's my fault, not yours, and don't feel bad about asking questions. That being said, I don't think I can see the chat window now once I've done this, done the presentation and share the screen. So we'll probably do questions afterwards. I aim to keep this to about 20 minutes. So we have plenty of time for discussion. And in the spirit of the conference, if this is a topic you want to talk more about, there are some opportunities to then carry on this discussion now that we have this kind of shared understanding. So the title of the session is called Commonize, which is a word I've created to characterize a process that's well established, but didn't really seem to have a word, and a design approach that's called Commonized design. And I'm going to define all those terms on the next slide. So to commonize is to place a shared resource under the governance of a community of people. And what that contrasts with are the choices we're usually given to know about, which is privatizing or nationalizing. So we can place things under governance of a company or a government. And those are usually the options we think are available. But there is another option, which is that community of people can actually manage resources. And of course, that is the most ancient form of management because people have been managing resources long before we had markets or states or capitalism. And the resource that is being managed is called a commons. So the commons is a shared resource governed by a community of people. And I will go through a bunch of examples on the next slide. For now, I just want to mention Wikipedia. It's kind of one of the more famous examples and people have used it. And so they kind of get the idea that it's a commonized encyclopedia. So it's, it's not ruled by a company or a state, but actually it's a product and constant reproduction of a group of people. And there are design principles around a commons, which are called Commonized design principles. And there are 8 of them, and we'll talk about I will go through those too. And what makes these principles different than design principles you see in other design disciplines is they all address how people jointly make and enforce rules to manage this commons. So maybe it doesn't sound sexy in the same way as like iterate or listen to people, but these are all about how people make rules to manage the commons. And they are economics principles, they're also design principles, or I'm trying to make into design principles. And so commonized design is a broader approach that we're starting off with these principles about how we manage resources that we depend on by increasing community control over those resources. And basically, there are three facets then really, and there's another framework I'm not going to talk about, but the facets of commonizing resources are the resources, the people and the roles they play, and the rules they use to manage it. Those are kind of the three facets, and that's how this process works. So we're going to just go through a quick timeline. And so for some of you, this is going to be old hat. For some, this is new. Just to give you a sense of a bunch of examples and also some of the key knowledge development in this field, just to hammer home kind of the robustness of this field and where we're entering into it. The first example I have is a Charter of the Forest in the year 1217. So this was created at the same time as Magna Carta. And this basically gives people the ability to manage and use the forest to meet all their needs. And back in the 1200s, the forest is everything. It's fuel, it's food, it's furniture. And so I just wanted to underpin the fact that this is a very ancient form of managing resources. It's just that we see scholarly research starting in the 70s, really. And so in the 70s, we see the Ostrom workshop. It's based on two academics with the surname Ostrom, and we'll talk about them too. And what they're asking is, sometimes people manage resources, and sometimes they do it a lot better than the state or the market. And why is that, and how are they doing it? And so they're looking at natural resource commons, and those are things like fisheries and irrigation systems and pastures. Nowadays, you might talk about community gardens. And so what they're really looking at is, how do people do this? And the result of that research is a book, or there's many results, but one of them is a book called Governing the Commons, published in 1990 by an academic named Eleanor Ostrom. And she publishes these 8 design principles then. And I think it's, so again, I want to underpin, these design principles we're going to talk about were published in 1990. They have been scrutinized and discussed and applied in all sorts of cases for decades since then, and they're still intact. And so while there are a lot of facets around the commons that are movable, around particularly how people see the commons in relation to capitalism, these principles have held. And Eleanor Ostrom goes on to receive the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. So these are a pretty good start principles. They're understood and they're well regarded. As we move into the 2000s, we start to look at commons that I think are a little more familiar to people because we're looking at the rise of the internet. And if you have a question, you want to interrupt me, just yell, because I can't see anybody. It's very frustrating that way. And I chose one book here called The Wealth of Networks by Yochai Benkler, because in this book, he coins the term commons-based peer production. And that's a term you may also run across. And that's also recognizing that the commons is not just a thing, but also a process of practice. And so another term we use for the social practice is commoning, but peer production is another way of talking about it. And we're starting to look at digital commons like Wikipedia, Linux, which is part of the free and open source software movement, and then things like rare disease research, where, for example, where if you have a rare disease, it's not profitable for a company to engage in it, governments aren't going to do anything. And so it ends up being down to people with that disease and the medical professionals involved to kind of find solutions, and they create their own kind of commons for that. As we move forward, just some more examples of, we're starting to see this intersection between both the digital, as we've seen with Wikipedia and Linux, and the physical, as we're able to, with 3D printing, make more things. And so we see things like prosthetics and farm tools and how people are making stuff more open source. And that's probably, those examples might ring for more people. I wrote a short part of a paper last year on ventilators at the height of the pandemic and how we can think about commonizing ventilators. So how we actually open up that process rather than relying on private companies to make them at points of shortage. And the last book I'll mention is Donut Economics. It's not a pivotal book in the commons field, but it's kind of like a major crossover hit in the economics field that people seem to be talking about, and I've seen it referenced several times here. And it mentions the commons and it mentions design. So it's a really good resource that kind of has brought to attention the role of the commons in an alternative economic future. And we're also now seeing discussions around the commons that are moving not just from local, but also to global challenges like climate change and outer space. So that is the quick timeline and some examples. Hopefully that makes sense to most people now. And I'm going to go on now to the actual design principles. I don't make a habit of reading a list when I'm doing a presentation, but everyone always wants to know about these principles. And so we're just going to go through them and have a little bit of some insight into some of these, just to get a sense of what these design principles look like, because they're a bit different than what designers are expecting often for design principles. So the first one is defining clear group boundaries. And what is helpful to point out here is that commons are often, they have a boundary. There's people who are members and not members. I think because of Wikipedia, we often assume that a commons is open to everyone and everyone can participate and everything's available. But traditionally, there were people in or out. If you're to be a member of the Lobster Fishery Commons, you have to be a lobster fisherman. If you want to participate in the Rare Disease Research Network, you probably have a rare disease or you're in the medical field working on it. So it's okay that there is a boundary. The second principle, I have nothing really to add. It's match rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. I think this is a bit more intuitive for people who have a design background. If you're an economist who wants to kind of say, this is our model, now let's just take it and replicate it, this is pointing out that you can't just do that. Number 3 is ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. And this sounds deceptively simple because it seems logical that people who are affected should be able to participate. But oftentimes, and we'll cover some examples, we're good at involving people in designing rules, but they then lack any agency over modifying them. The 4th rule is about ensuring the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. And the important thing here is to raise that the commons is about possession and not ownership. So very often the resource we're talking about is not owned by the people using it. The example I like to use is the staff kitchen. If we can all remember back when we had a staff kitchen, it is a form of commons. It's a really good example of kind of a mundane, everyday commons in our lives where there's no one telling us what to do. It's up to us to kind of manage that space, but we don't own it. Our employer usually owns that space, but we have the right to use it. 5, 6, and 7 are really about how we kind of develop, monitor, and enforce the rules. So number 5 is about developing a system to monitor members' behavior. 6 is about using sanctions for people who violate the rules. And 7 is about providing means for dispute resolution. So really monitoring, sanctions, resolution. And that's kind of, I think people don't expect to see that when we're talking about design principles, but they're really important for managing a commons. And the 8th principle is a longer sentence about building responsibility for governing the commons resource in nested tiers is the key word there, from lowest up to the entire interconnected system. And I think that this also comes a bit more naturally to people in design. They're used to thinking about kind of systems, but it's just to point out that rather than tackling an entire system, commons are often bit by bit and they're joined together. So for example, with the ventilator I mentioned before, we can look at how we commonize the ventilator, but we also have to look at how it's produced. So the people working on that are looking at how to make the design open and also how to make it easy to produce. But then where it's produced will affect the next step. And maybe that's in a private shop, but maybe that can also be commonized as a hack space. And then it goes into a hospital and that's another system. So those are the principles. What I also want to highlight though, is there are some other issues kind of around ideology around the commons that is often lost in translation. When I've seen researchers, particularly some of the participatory design research, use the principles and for very understandable reasons not know the rest of this. And so part of my task is how do we capture the rest of the ideology around the commons field to make sure it's kind of accessible to other people. And there are 2 aspects I want to point out to differentiate what I call commonized design versus other design approaches that we're more familiar with. So I'm going to start off with participatory design and co-design. So a lot of you probably have some experience with that. I think most everyone here seems to have kind of a design background. And that's really about how people participate, have political agency, how they participate in making the rules, maybe enforcing them. And the example might be a park, and you involve residents in designing the park. But what very rarely happens is you design the park and then the residents go on to manage the park, right? The park usually then defaults into the ownership or the management of another organization. And so commonized design is looking not just at increasing political agency, so people have a say, but also economic agency, so control over that park and the means of producing and reproducing the leisure of that park. The other aspect is, another example is decentralized design and distributed design. These are pretty hot design topics these days. And the fintech people, you probably have lots of insight into this as well. They do aim to address economic agency. So really bringing, Bitcoin aims to make it possible for people to participate in making currency through mining and to participate in that system. But for the most part, we don't have any agency, political agency. We don't get to change the rules on Bitcoin or enforce them. They're kind of already set, and we can just participate in that system. And also when it comes to things like distributed design for design goods, like clothing, it is about trying to reallocate, make it more available to different people, but ultimately we don't have a say necessarily in how the systems work. So that is kind of 2 ideology, the political economy of commonized design that I wanted to just raise as well. The task ahead, and this is where my research focus is moving from what I consider a period of inductive research to a period of generative research. And so we've had decades now of scholars using inductive reasoning to identify the principles from thousands of case studies. So they're looking at real world stuff and figuring out what is going on, and there's principles and patterns and in various kind of other aspects people are trying to discern from that. But when it comes to imagining the future and articulating an alternative future, we have to generate ideas. We aren't going to, they don't exist for us. And so how do we take all this work that's been done and use it in a generative capacity to create different solutions to our problems? And so I borrowed from, this is the latest version of I think it's the Framework for Innovation from the Design Council. As I admitted in my last session, I've never used this double diamond. If you've never heard of it, it doesn't matter. It's just to show a research process. The reason I pulled on it, though, is if we imagine those diamonds as the research process, they put this other diamond now called design principles in there. And they've prescribed what they are. Well, poop out of that. The question is, what kind of principles do we use in our research process? And so what I'm really advocating for is if we take these commonized design principles as an approach and plug that into our research process or whatever kind of process, how does that help us redefine the problems and deliver different kinds of solutions? And the other aspect I put in actually today after our workshop this morning was about who. Because I hear a lot of people talking about this as if it's the designer with a capital D who's doing this. But the reality is that this may be something that is being used by activists, community group leaders, service directors inside a government agency. So this is really expanding who we think about is doing design and how they're using it. And so I just want to emphasize that point too. The last slide is just two cases. So for me, my research going forward is that generative work and collaborating with other people to apply Commonized design to their ideas and seeing what we come up with. And so it's a process I invite anyone here to participate in. I would love to chat more about that, and we'll maybe get to chat a little after this. But to give you two cases of what that looks like. And generally what I've been doing is we've created a provocation, we've had a design workshop, and then created a design fiction afterwards is kind of the starting process I've tried out. In the top case study, this was for a workshop in speculative energy futures for the Nordic conference. And what I asked, kind of propositioned was, let's take an offshore wind farm as an example, is what happens if we explore how non-human beings have agency in this process? So there is a term for this called environmental personhood. It was started in New Zealand by giving rivers personhood status. And what it means in particular is it allows people to take polluters to court. But it can do other things too. And so basically I was asking is, if we look at principle 3 about ensure that those affected by the rules can participate, well, what if those affected is not just people, but birds and fish? How do they have a voice in the design and management of an offshore wind farm? The bottom case study was for a workshop called Cloudless Skies for the Mobile HCI conference, in which I asked about what happens if we commonize mobile network infrastructure. Mobile network infrastructure is entirely either privatized or nationalized. There's no commonized version of it, to my knowledge, anywhere really. And yet you've probably seen articles at some point in the last 2 months about some government turning off the internet on its citizens. So this is a pretty big issue, right? How do we get people to have control over the mobile network infrastructure? And so I was playing here with principle 4 around ensuring that the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. And my provocation was pretty straightforward about kind of thinking about like affordable housing, where we give 20% over of the infrastructure to people. But what's interesting in our workshop is coming up with more of an occupy strategy. So before any government gives us that kind of permission, there are lots of people already kind of doing this in places where no one really cares too much if they're doing it. And so that was more of an occupation strategy, which is very common if we're looking at kind of countercultural movements. And getting us to think about all the stuff that is happening around kind of the occupation of the infrastructure and what that could look like for a future commonized mobile network infrastructure. So that I think is the last slide. Yes, then it's just my contact details. So I'm going to escape and stop sharing so I can see people again. And so you can now turn your video back on. And so, yeah, so we've expanded a bit. I've just left this open now for kind of a broad discussion rather than breakouts. I'd love to hear people's ideas, feedbacks, particularly how you see this working within your context. And as I said, I'm happy to follow up with people around how we kind of try out developing Commonized design using the resources that you care about. So I will stop talking now. Okay, there's that. Okay, so you can all turn your videos back on now, though.
I just have a comment to make to say thank you, and that this idea of using what already exists in design is really good, because I think often in a design school we're tempted to start from scratch, which can be pretty frustrating and not productive. So I think this is quite nice to go deep with these 8 rules that already exist. It's good.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's really interesting, because you know, there is such a history in some of these kind of other areas that have explored these things before. So that's I think that's a really good point. But I also, just to add to that, I think the ability for design as a way of working and designers to be able to create some translation of some of these things, I think is really powerful, you know, just to combine that, the fact that there is already the stuff there and designers' ability to translate that. I've seen this with the student that I had this year who was working around systems thinking and translating it for the fashion industry. And it was just really interesting how they approached it, looking at things like how children already instinctively understand things, you know, so even going back to sort of primary school models for how some of these things work. So yeah, it's interesting to see that.
Justin, is it okay to ask some questions?
Oh yeah, sorry. So I have no great plan. I was expecting there to be like 4 people. So I'm excited that there's more than that. So I didn't arrange breakout sessions, and more just to kind of let the things flow and see if that works out okay.
Sure. I mean, I'm totally happy with that. I mean, thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your work. It's very interesting. I mean, I have a few different questions. I mean, I think your prior background is very interesting in economic history, and I think one of the things that I'm interested in through the work I'm doing in a project called Counterframing Design. It's an AHRC funded project that I'm leading at the moment, is around the aesthetics of economy. And I mean, I think that this is a very significant and underexplored aspect of how we as designers can engage with the question of new economics. And I think that the Commons has significant challenges around aesthetics. And in general, I mean, I think there's a certain normativity around Commons discourse in design that has a relation to this question of aesthetics. But my meandering question is, I guess one is, could you comment a little bit on your what you think about aesthetics and economics, and more specifically, you know, what do you think are some of the challenges, or, you know, the limits, or can we be more self-reflexive and critical as a discipline of design around some of this normativity in relation to Commons?
What do you mean by the normativity in relation to Commons?
I think there's I think, you know, what are the challenges that we need to take up in relation to this, aside from what we can see the benefits of Commons doing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I want to make sure I don't ramble too much here. So one of the, I think the challenges is often where the opportunities exist to try doing this, because it isn't really often commercial, right? It's often very counter commercial or counter capitalist, and so finding those opportunities can be often very difficult to do this. And which is also why I'm doing this as a PhD, because I can get paid to actually do this for once. But then how does this actually happen in real life? And this is where, you know, does this get, who's going to be able to use this, particularly if, you know, is it for money, or are they going to build it as, you know, it's just part of their passion? And so I think, though, within the bigger challenge, or for those who are interested anyway, is just this process of realizing that neoliberal capitalism is construction. So where I did not present much about here is looking at this as concept of the imaginary, and the economic imaginary is kind of a subset. And the imaginary really is just the models in all of our heads that we share together that allow us to function. Because otherwise, if an alien landed and you said like, what's the business plan for this? Like they would have no idea what you're talking about. Or you said like, let's meet for a cup of coffee and discuss this. They don't know what you mean. And those models can change, but they change through contestation and conflict. And you have to recognize that though, in order to be able to create the conflict and to contest meaning. And so I think that first hurdle for people to recognize that there are alternatives and it is possible for alternatives to exist is to me, I feel like the biggest hurdle of all. And I think really my starting research question is, how do we just get people to imagine a post-capitalist economy? I'm not really trying to create it now. Economic transition takes generations, but just being able to imagine it and think about it is a really important step. And as highlighted, imagining is hard, but we don't have to reinvent the framework we use to imagine. We actually have some really starting points. We can use others, but this is one that makes it easy to just build on rather than having to do the hard work of inventing a whole new world for ourselves. And as far as the aesthetics, there's actually a book called Commonism, The Aesthetics of the New Real, which is based on Mark Fisher's idea around and I think that's maybe getting a little complicated for the whole group, and I'm not sure I fully understand all of it myself, to be honest. But I think it also still has to do with the fact that in order to take a step back and recognize that the system we're in is constructed and can changes the entire aesthetics. Because often we're trapped in discussions. I worked a lot in corporate social responsibility and sustainable development, and a lot of this language and a lot of this work is still trapped within capitalism, a capitalist frame. And so it is hard to get outside of it. I don't think I have the right answer for that, but what I am trying to do is to use design as an approach that's tangible, it's kind of concrete, so it makes it easier for people to say, okay, I'm better able to imagine what a different future could look like, because I think otherwise it's very, it's ethereal and wishy-washy and it sounds utopian. I'm not sure that answered your question though, Sharon.
I mean, I appreciate your response for sure, and it resonates with some of the things that I have been thinking about for sure. So yeah, thank you.
I'm reading Kashama's Commons and Publics. Okay, so you can always, so Kashama asked about where is the overlap between commons and publics? Also, the commons seems to perhaps devolve into an expertise versus affected parties problem in terms of political power of members of a common, going into gatekeeping. Also, the design justice issue, which you briefly touched upon with the example of non-human parties being affected. So I'll leave that over other people if they have. The publics is something that I haven't touched on too much as a field. In terms of design justice, I think the part that I've really touched on with design justice is about the creating of the worlds we need. And this is about creating a different world. And in order to create a different world, you need a different set of principles for what you think that world should look like. And so that's what I was trying to emphasize in that kind of image around the generative design approach, which is if we're still stuck in the frame of delivering value and kind of how a company sells products, we can't really escape the world we're in. So how do we think about a different world we want to get to and what that could look like? And what I think Commonized design offers is a little bit of a infrastructure for what that world could look like. So it's not complete fantasy and starting from scratch. But other people, if you have a response to that question, please go ahead, because I don't think I have anything particularly to say there.
I think Isaac wants to say something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your presentation. And I was thinking about this thing that you were mentioning about translating using design. What's exactly what you have in mind when you say translating? For example, which tools of design or which approaches in design are you going to be using? Because I think for designers, it's very important to focus on practicalities, and because you're talking about this new world that it's going to be. Then what are those practicalities that you want to put there?
Absolutely. So there are kind of two aspects of design. So first is design innately thinks about who's receiving and using the products that we're producing. And so that forces you to think about communication and clarity. And so that translation aspect is kind of compelled by design, because you have to think about who's going to use this, rather than if I had done this, I originally would have done this topic in a political economy department, and I'm running for other political economists. Whereas in design, I'm able to think a bit further about I'm designing for other people. As far as the methods bit, so I'm mostly using speculative design methodology and kind of a few different methods. There's a really great opportunity to do experiential and game design. There's another framework I haven't talked about that is based on game theory. So economics has game theory and it is games. There's even a board game I'm going to be ordering called Commons Poly, which is supposed to be a Monopoly version of the Commons. The pandemic kind of kiboshed a lot of the experiential stuff I had planned on doing because I think it's been hard to do that virtually. So I've kind of put the experiential kind of game playing components to the side until maybe next year, and mostly focusing on things that are going to be virtual, which is often a speculative design approach to imagine, looking at these different kind of commonized versions of things. But I'm really happy. Part of this is to hear you may have other ideas and other things that where you think it suits. As I said, my background is in economics and design research is newer to me, so there's a whole bunch I don't know. So I really welcome your ideas, and we can try them. I'm very happy to try them. Is anyone working on, like looking at things like we talked about mobile networks, we talked about wind farms? Is anyone working on topics where these kinds of questions come up for your own research, or this offers a different insight into things you're working on?
Well, I think Justin, that we're working on quite a lot of stuff to do with data at the moment, and thinking about different models of ownership sharing kind of around that. And I think, there's obviously stuff around there that we're already looking at, work at the sort of Open Data Institute who we're working with on these kind of things as well. Also some quite interesting stuff coming out of, there's stuff in Barcelona around Salus co-op and the kind of ideas about different ways of thinking about this. But certainly I'm really interested in data and the commons and kind of how that works around some models, specifically when there's the alternative models in there are very heavily sort of capitalist. So yeah, I mean, obviously that's something we want to kind of explore further, hopefully at some point. Absolutely. But definitely I think there's a big thing around data and this, because a lot of the push on data stuff at the moment seems to be very much around personal data. And obviously there's many different things that we want to think about in the mix here. So trying to look at quite complex models, and I think using speculative design and fictions around that, I think is going to be really important to try and help engage with the possibilities of that. So that's just one thing that we're working on at the moment as well.
And we go back to those principles with the data trusts, or people are talking about it. And if we think about them as data commons, it helps us think a little differently about who's affected by these rules. And what I've seen in my one project on a data trust or trustish kind of thing was that we often think about how people input into the beginning of the process, but they really lose control after they've kind of shared their data. And so we think about health data. We really don't have control in the way the commons would prescribe around how we manage that. And I think often, like with the track and trace program, that could have actually been done. I consider that they haven't been done much better in a commonized format, because people, when they've created the rules, are more likely to follow them and enforce them. And so you also get a wealth of opinions and perspectives on how to make that work. So I think it's a really good point. And the data treating data trust as a data commons is an area where I think there's a lot to learn in that crossover.
Yeah, I agree. So John's wants to say something as well.
Hello, that was really interesting. I was just when Simon was talking there, I realized, and I'm not an academic, but we have got a little client project that we're just starting in the next few weeks with a housing association. So notionally with the head of technology, although also with the head of customer service and so on. An initial thoughts have centered around what happens if you take almost beginning to think about sort of all of the data that the housing association holds, although they don't hold it very well, hence the new head of technology, and almost making that a common space. So everyone has a kind of like a flat understanding of the data of where this house is, what's in this house, what is around it, and the sort of like the neighborhood around you, which is also under the purview of that housing association. Because I think there's sort of like from initial research conversations, there has been it's one of these relationships where the housing association naturally thinks that all the residents are trying to get what they can, and the residents are trying to assume that the housing association are trying to give them as little as possible. So what opportunity is there for kind of like a common set of data, sort of a single point of what is the house, what is the home that you are the custodian for, and how do you introduce that flatness to the data and the information around it in the middle?
Well, and I think it's maybe the flatness of the governance, not the data, because kind of the data is data. It's what you end up using, the kind of rules you put around that data. And so what often happens is that mistrust is because the data is a kind of extracted from people, and then people don't know what's happening to it. And so, if we kind of go back to some of those rules and just think about, well, okay, if we think of the data it's neutral, but it's how we treat that data and what we do with it and who's involved and who can manage it. That's how we start to resolve these problems. It's a really scary step, though. That's I think that if they're willing to have a conversation, I don't think a conversation does not mean it's going to happen. So I think that's okay. It's okay, but it enables people to start to think about how we solve a lot of the mistrust issues. So I think a very recent example with say Facebook, when they censored the former president because of his actions, it might have been that we as a people decided that we would have censored that person on rules we generated. But I think a lot of the controversy was the fact that it was a private company whose had their own rules and made the decisions about who to enforce violations. How, as you talk about, enforcing rules. And so often just about how we allow people to be part of creating those rules and enforcing them, and that removes mistrust. And you might have a similar outcome, but you have a very different sentiment around that outcome. So yeah, I think it's a great example. And if you want to take it further, we can have a chat further. I mean, to me, I think it's it's a very low pressure thing, just saying what if, and just to see what that generates. Because I think there's as I mentioned, like with that mobile network thing case study, there's a middle ground, right? I'm not naive. We're not going to all of a sudden commonize these resources, but there may be some middle ground that allows us to start to move towards that and achieve some better kind of governance structures that is in the middle.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. Yeah, let's pick up after.
Did someone? I keep missing these questions. Simon, you seem to have questions, but I'm not seeing them. So just unmute yourself and talk if you have a question.
No, I can't see anybody else with their hand up at the moment. So yeah.
Oh, and it's almost 1:45. Wow. Okay. So what I will say is, in good old like a normal workshop style, I will linger after this workshop finishes. And if you want to have a chat, we have I think 15 minutes before the next workshop. So we can pretend we're lingering after the workshop, and then we're running to get coffee and going to the next workshop. Yes, so I'll be here. Oh, I did not put up my contact details. I'll put them here. And everything, I'm assuming, will be shared. You can get the presentation. So that's my email address and my Twitter account, which I have not been using for a decade, but now I'm attempting to use Twitter again. So however you feel comfortable contacting me. As I said, I could talk about this all day. I get a lot. This is really the first full-on public presentation I've done on my research since I started last year. And so even just your feedback on what you think and how I communicated, what you would like to see more of or less of. Again, this is a translation process as well. I welcome all that because, as you said, this stuff is there. It's really about how we make it accessible and people are able to use it is the process I'm focusing on. So I welcome any of your feedback later on. We can follow up as well anytime.
Okay, well, I mean, I would just like to say thank you so much, Justin, and everybody else for here to contribute. I mean, we're only about 2 or 3 sessions into this, and we've got like another 15, 16, 17 coming up over, and I'm already just, it's just great, just the sort of variety of conversations that we're having. So yeah, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to hang around just a minute afterwards as well, just to talk to you.
Well, thank you, everybody. It was great to meet you. Thank you for making time to be here, because I know it's a busy time for everyone. And I hope to see you or chat with you again sometime. And I'll certainly see you at other workshops at the conference. Oh, Joanna, are you still here then? Let's see here. I just saw your message. You're muted.
Oh, no. I think my camera's not working. Can you see?
I was like,
No,
maybe
can't see.
I saw you earlier. Maybe she's having, maybe she's in the bathroom. I don't.
All right. No, it's it's just black. I'm sorry I missed the start of your thing. I had an appointment, but yeah, your work looks really interesting, and I really like to look through your slides. I mean, if you could just tell me what the topic of your PhD is exactly, because I missed the start of your presentation.
Yes. So basically, I mean, and I still haven't done my upgrade, so you're asking a question that is, we still, being a little more specific, but the topic generally is looking at how we can use design to help people imagine a post-capitalist future. And within that, I'm looking at how we can use commonized design as a design research approach to help people imagine an alternative future. And that's where I'm at so far, is how I describe it. But what I'm specifically doing is using design as a way to both translate the commons field into a design research approach, and then looking at how, by using that design research approach of commonized design, what kind of world we're able to build with it, and how that helps us to further develop the design, that commonized design approach, to help more people use these principles and practices from the economics field in their own practice.
Fabulous.
I'm not, hopefully, as I said, as you know, I'm a 1 year my PhD, so I'm still in that phase of, oh yes, describe my PhD. So
that sounds so interesting. I really look forward to following what you come up with. Who are you doing that with?
So I am at Lancaster University. My supervisors are Paul Colton and Rachel Cooper. So they're very different people in terms of their research approach. So it's been an interesting kind of match between. But I've been happy to find support in terms of, it's a bit out there as a topic. And so it's been good to people to embrace my somewhat anti-capitalist tendencies in my research. It's not always easy to find people who are okay with that. Yeah, so we're down the road from Loughborough, kind of, over in Lancaster. And I'm happy, Joanna, to just, I can arrange to have a chat later on and go through this. And you know a lot more. I wasn't sure in terms of the knowledge base for people coming in, and so part of this is kind of that balance of explaining a new topic, but also not boring people either. But I lost sharing. Sorry. So. Hi, Isaac. Hi, Ross.
Yeah, who did you say? Did you say Paul? Was it Paul Rogers?
Paul Colton.
Colpin. Okay, I don't know. Paul Colpin. And so, do either of your supervisors have a background in economics? Are you the sort of economics?
No. So I mean, no. I don't. Not really. No. So I think that's I'm not sure I know who does. It's a weird combo, I feel like.
Yeah, it is. That's why it's so great to see this happening, because it's very unusual. And
yes.
Excellent. It's very exciting.
Yeah. So I've kind of chosen, originally I was going to do this in the political economy department, and but I just felt like there was something missing around how to reach more people around alternative economics, and economics just doesn't do that. I mean, I can aspire to be Kate Rayworth, but I may not really, we're not going to produce a book like she does. So how do we use design as a better way to engage people in that imagination? So no, I do think, I don't know, Ross, if you know, I don't think anyone in our department, it's not a common combination. And so I'm okay being that person who's kind of economics and design, and I'm happy to be that person for other people.
Sure. Well, it's a wonderful resource for the design community, and I mean, in my opinion, it's been very badly historically. I'm going to write a paper. My next paper actually is going to be why the political economy is so badly understood in design, because I think there's some reasons why, like design specific things happen within design theory that make it very different from, say, media theory, where the political economy is very big. Like most universities have that do media studies have like the political economy of media. It's a big thing, but it's just not happened in design for, you know, I think, yeah, and it's really stunted our ability to understand why we sort of continue along certain trajectories.
Well, I think part of it also is, so a lot of my background was working in communities to build economic literacy and confidence to engage in economic development discussions, because often people are made to feel like economics and economic development is something for experts to do, and it's not something that, you know, unless you understand that, you can't really participate. And so I think a little bit happens with the design community, which is, you know, since it's not something people focus on, and people often can be very self-deprecating around, you know, their lack of maybe economic knowledge. Maybe there's this hesitancy to kind of challenge it. And so I hope, you know, one of my aims within this research is to translate it in a way that shows like there is this whole body of other stuff that responds to design justice, design activism, antagonistic design. These other terms I keep running across, like it does respond, it's there. And you hopefully you give you enough to know to engage in that conflict and not feel like you're an amateur. Because yeah, so I don't know, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's kind of one way I'm hoping to kind of remedy that intersection through this process.
Yeah. I don't mean to dominate the conversation, Isaac and Ross, or you feel free to just butt in.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that you are saying about designers and having this kind of, I don't know, rejection for the political economy. Because I have been thinking a lot about that in my research, which is related to the circular economy. It's about what kind of institutions do designers need to actually take on in a different kind of design, that it's not this capitalistic commercial oriented design. So because I think, yeah, because I think that's in the practical sense, it's a question that I think even design students would have if they wanted to do another kind of design.
Yes.
Where would they be doing that?
I think working with the public sector will tell you that you won't have the same amount of money and budget or for whatever you do in a capitalistic way. So I would say straightforward work with the public sector, the third, charities and all this stuff. And then you will see the how you design stuff without industries, basically, let's say. But yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to learn some stuff here stuff. I mean, I learned a lot. I've just started to read and do stuff in the area of commons. So I'm a designer. So I had a discussion with Justin about it, and basically I was not even looking at political economy and all this stuff. You know, I'm there to support whoever wants to do that. I'm not really engaging in that political economy. So like I'm the one creating the resources or resource systems, I would say. Let's see what happened after. And one thing that Justin just said about you've been working with communities and building capacities for them to engage in the political economy stuff. It's something that, you know, I start to think Codesign can do that. I'm not sure how you kind of trained them or supported them.
Well, skills. I mean, so the work I've been doing, I mean, it's funny because the work, so the work I mentioned, for example, this was when I was at NEF, where we designed a workshop process called Plugging the Leaks, which allows companies to imagine the economy like a bucket and the money coming in like the water, and then I have the bucket and the leaks and water. So it was actually a design process because we basically got them going through thinking like how money comes in, how it leaks out, what are ways to get that money circulating back in, and then using another concept called the multiplier, which helps them think about, well, we could try to have a localized version of, sometimes they say gas at petrol station because we want that, but then realizing, well, actually most of that money is going to leave because we don't have local petrol. So what's another approach to kind of trying to bring money in, capture it and bring it back in? But they were going through a design process. I didn't know it was called that because this was 20 years ago where we didn't have that term. And then a lot of my work subsequently was working with the public sector on how to shape procurement processes to achieve social and economic and environmental goals. So if you have a construction project, how do you shape that so that you can also promote job growth and business growth in your area? And also maybe look at recycling or landfill. That also turns out to be called service design, but again, we didn't have that term 15 years ago, so we just were doing it. So there's a lot actually happening that's called design that no one knew to call it design because we didn't have that term, or even now, maybe they don't know it exists as a term, so they're not using it. So this kind of co-design approach is essentially what was happening in these economic literacy workshops. It just wasn't a term we had back then to call it that. One of the challenges we do face though is that moving from the ideas into actually doing them, and that's because you often need more support to take that forward, and that's where a lot of those kinds of ideas would often kind of stop. But with the circular stuff, I think what you mentioned, I think my aspiration is that if we're able to teach students, and I have like ideas for classes, but they're more interdisciplinary than just for design students, but just to say, okay, there are other models out there, right? Circular economy is one of them. We have the donut, we have the commons. So there's all these other models. What if we approach some of these design problems in a different way and use different models for them? What can we come up with? And I think people are excited to do them. I think one of the challenges does remain, particularly for the design profession, is the jobs that pay to do design work don't necessarily want you to do that. And so it means it's kind of happening as a hobby or in your community activism or your other work. And I recognize that is one of the challenges, is where are the opportunities to be paid to do it. And that's often that's kind of one of the reasons maybe we don't see a proliferation of that. But at the same time, there are opportunities within academia for sure. And within the public sector, there is often some room. And even sometimes within some companies, there's a little bit of room. But generally the nonprofit field, the government field and academic field, there are opportunities to create that space. But yeah, it is a privilege to be able to even get to do that. So I kind of am not even thinking that's not a problem. But we still need to articulate it because the ability for it to happen is also, the more we talk about it, the more likely things can happen. And so who knows, maybe that housing association I mentioned, like maybe they'll be interested. It could be a way to save money. I mean, these things, in a lot of the original Commons cases weren't done as an express way to kind of contest the government or the market, but actually just as a better way to manage something. So the other aspect is to start to demand more from capitalism in terms of, say, we have like Facebook. There's a lot of criticism on how they're using the commons. A lot of the private sector is based on the commons. So Windows, Apple, they all use Linux, right? This is a commons-based open software that's created for free, and then they all capture it, enclose it, and sell it. And if we're aware of that, and we're aware of the fact that a lot of what we create is actually then sold back to us, we can start to maybe ask differently for how that works. Maybe Facebook should be paying us because we are the ones actually creating the value. Maybe these other systems shouldn't be charging us because we create that value. So there's another element there, which is maybe there's a lot we're paying for. Like vaccines are another good example where we paid for most of these vaccines to be developed and distributed. And so why are they going to then charge us later on for them? So anyway, so that was, I don't have a great answer. It's a systemic, it's a multi-generational issue. And it won't happen necessarily in my lifetime. So that's a bitter pill to swallow sometimes, that like the work you're doing is not going to be realized necessarily while you're alive. But people, yeah, sorry.
Oh, really? Do you think so?
Think what?
That it won't be realized in our lifetime, because I don't think that we have many more lifetimes.
Well, so there is,
like ecosystem wise, it's not that, in terms of other, I think that things have to be accelerate slightly from what we're used to historically in terms of changing system structures, or else we're going to have we might not have the ability to like change and to just like wait for a few more lifetimes.
I think the specter of climate change and the end of human civilization is something that I want to be optimistic. I think we're going to avoid that by making these kinds of changes. it's beyond, you know, I want to be optimistic we're going to make those changes. I also think that we may not make those changes. And like you said, that maybe it's too late. But then having a job won't matter anymore because we won't be here.
Justin, thank you so much. I'd love to chat with you some more about this. So I'm going to send you an email, and hopefully I'll see you in some other sessions. I'm going to go to the next session now.
Yes. So yeah, we need to end that. Sorry, guys. Let me end that so we can go to the next session. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.